On behalf of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace and the Department of Sociology's Critical Race Initiative, both housed in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, I offer you a very warm welcome to today's symposium, Conquering the Root Causes of Racial Prejudice. A special welcome to my colleague, Dr. Michael Penn, and his students from Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania. We're very pleased that you could make it today. Dr. Bobo, Dr. Eberhardt, Dr. Hutchings, we are honored by your presence here today. We welcome you to the University of Maryland. Despite their busy schedules, our distinguished guests agreed to be with us today and to expand our knowledge about the root causes of racial prejudice and our responsibility toward its elimination. I would be remiss if I didn't thank another person, Dr. Rayshawn Ray, who is sitting at that end, from the Department of Sociology and the Critical Race Initiative, for his support and significant role in making possible the realization of today's symposium. Thank you very much, Dr. Ray. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I am the holder of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland. Today's symposium is the launch of a series of programs sponsored by the Baha'i Chair for World Peace on the theme of structural racism and the root causes of prejudice. Racial prejudice continues to be a force of destruction to human life and destructive to the foundation of the social order. Advancing scientific knowledge about the root causes of racial prejudice is a central goal or objective of any institution of higher learning. Likewise, conquering the root causes of racial prejudice should be a fundamental goal toward building a just and harmonious society in which everyone's fundamental human rights and the right to human dignity is protected. Toward this end, the three presentations today by our distinguished speakers will expand and elucidate our understanding of the scourge of racism and will point us to solutions regarding the root causes of prejudice. Equally important to our search for solutions is the fact that racism is a major impediment to the possibility of a better world. It is a topic that is not only relevant, but is central to any endeavor toward peacemaking. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stated, "True peace is not merely the absence of tension. It is the presence of justice." Racism and prejudice fundamentally undermine prospects for a more peaceful world. Racial prejudice perpetuates an offensive violation of human dignity, denies untold opportunities to its victims, impairs human progress, corrupts its perpetrators. There are absolutely no grounds upon which the blight of racial prejudice can be justified. Our intent in examining pathways to conquering the root causes of racial prejudice concerns the need for our recognition of the nobility and inherent dignity of every human being. It concerns our exploration and implementation of building community and society capable of supporting, encouraging, and safeguarding, especially the minorities, and in celebrating diversity's strength in enhancing and enriching culture.
Okay, thank you all for that warm welcome. I'm happy to be here this afternoon. I want to thank the folks at the Baha'i Center Institute, and of course, Professor Ray for that introduction. Neither Professor Bobo nor Professor Eberhardt and I got together to coordinate our studies, our presentations, but I think in many respects, what I hope to present over the next 25, 30 minutes builds nicely on what I heard earlier as well. That is to say, Dr. Bobo's emphasis on the enduring nature of racism, perhaps the morphing nature of racism, and Dr. Eberhardt's emphasis on the stigma associated with African Americans play a big role in what I'll be talking about as well. That is, my focus as a political scientist will be on the political implications of some of the things that we've already heard in the excellent presentations that have preceded me, the ways in which the stigma associated with blacks and the pervasiveness of racial bias in its many forms affects how we engage in the political world, how we select our political candidates, how we identify with political parties. And if I'm persuasive here, you'll agree with me at the end of this process that it has very important implications for what we all do and for whom we all support. Because I'm going to talk about the ways in which politics is infused, or I should say how race is infused in the political judgments that we make all the time. And we can do something about it. I think it's appropriate to begin with, well, a reference to Martin Luther King. I'm thinking you've probably heard of him. And Dr. King had a number of important comments with respect to our theme this afternoon. But this is a less often mentioned quote from Dr. King, given not too long before he was assassinated in 1968, where he makes a very kind of blunt and pessimistic judgment about the pervasiveness of race in American society. As you can see there on screen, I won't read it for you, but the point here is that he's making a comment about the extent to which race is almost all-encompassing in the, as he puts it, the body politic. And that's kind of the jumping off point for my comments this afternoon. Race does, in fact, implicate what occurs in the political arena. And I think sometimes we don't, as consumers of political news and as citizens, appreciate just how pervasive it is. And obviously, Dr. King was talking back in 1968, but jumping ahead now to the 21st century, as we'll see here momentarily, the impact of race remains quite significant. Indeed, it's increased since the time of Dr. King's comments. All right, so I'm going to make some comments here briefly just to make sure we're all on the same page. I think many of us in this room are familiar with the points I'm about to make, but the extent to which I like to begin a lot of my talks with this information I'm about to provide, because I think the extent to which the racial divisiveness embedded in our political system today, not 50 years ago, but today, is something that's not often very well appreciated. So the first point I want to make is that the political parties in our country, the two major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are exceptionally divided along racial lines, and have been for the last 50 years or so, and by most of the best estimates available, are getting more polarized over time on this basis. So even as we hear a lot in the press about the partisan nature of our politics, the divisiveness, et cetera, all of that is overlain with the politics of race and ethnicity, some of which we've already heard about this morning, which makes for a very combustible mixture. I think many of us already know these things. I'm going to try to elaborate on it a bit more as I move forward. But if you didn't already know, you should know that the basic demographic composition of the membership of the Republican Party is disproportionately and overwhelmingly white. And the Democrats move very much in the opposite direction. That's what I was getting at before in terms of the racial division in our party system. Another important point, Dr. Bobo emphasized this throughout most of his comments this afternoon, that white Americans, in spite of some important and even perhaps groundbreaking changes in racial attitudes over time, in terms of at least some measures of racial conservatism, or what one might call modern forms of racial bias, there's been striking persistence over the last several decades. So we have persistence coexisting with changes or even declines in some forms of racial bias or racial prejudice. Those features that I'm making reference to today, and that's going to really structure my comments this afternoon, are really what provide the incentives for the title of my talk, which I've already taken off screen now, but which is gets to the incentives that are provided for political actors to play to this landscape that we've been talking about this afternoon. So we've talked a lot about the racial conservatism that's embedded in the American electorate. And Professor Eberhardt talked a lot about the stigma that's associated in particular with African Americans. What do politicians do with that information? And how do voters respond to the actions that politicians take? That's really what I'll be talking about this afternoon. My argument is that politicians, political elites, and by this I mean individuals who run for office, as well as politically notable figures like the Rush Limbaughs, et cetera, they have irresistible, they're confronted with an irresistible landscape that presents with them the opportunity to exploit this conservatism for political gain. Some political elites resist this, but most of them don't. And the main theme of my comments this afternoon are going to be politicians don't resist this temptation to play to our racial fears and biases, because doing so, that is to say, playing to those fears, it works. It works. All right, so divisiveness. What do I mean? Well, we all know, of course, that in 2012, Barack Obama faced Mitt Romney in the presidential contest, the two major parties. Barack Obama was, of course, reelected. Romney had a fair showing, but not enough to get the necessary electoral votes to win the election. We all know, I think, and I've already reminded you, that there was a kind of a racial divide in the way in which the vote played out in 2012, but sometimes we don't have a true appreciation for how that played out. So Romney got almost 60% of the white vote. This is just based on national exit polls. He got almost 60%. That's a very good showing. By the way, his 39% showing, these are just figures, obviously those are representing percentages. The 39% showing that he got, that Obama got among whites is, you'd have to go back to Walter Mondale in 1984 to find a Democratic presidential candidate who got that small a percentage of the white vote. Bill Clinton in 1992 also got 39%, but as you may know or remember, there were really kind of three candidates in that election with the Ross Perot candidacy. So Barack Obama did historically bad on many dimensions with respect to the white vote, but he won in any case, partly, although I won't focus a lot on that this afternoon, maybe in the Q&A if you're curious, but part of this is because the share of the electorate that is white has been declining steadily over time. If the election played out in the demographics that I'm about to show you here on screen, it played out in a similar way, say in 1996, then Mitt Romney would be the president of the United States. All right, so it isn't just that there's a small, slight indication that race and partisanship map onto each other, or vote choice in this case. It is an extreme case. And you might be thinking, oh my God, that 90-some-odd% of African Americans voting for Obama, well, that's because it's the first black candidate for the presidency. But actually, these numbers look more or less comparable in just about any election that we look at over the last 50 years. The last time a Democratic presidential candidate for the presidency received the majority or plurality of the white vote, the last time this happened, all right, bear with me, some of you already know the answer to this, Lyndon Johnson in 1964. That's the last time it's happened. All right, hopefully I got your attention with that one. So I talked about vote choice, presidential vote choice, and now I'm going to talk just very briefly about what's known as party identification. Party identification in many respects precedes the vote choice. The argument in the literature is that it's kind of a conceptual lens or perceptual lens through which people understand, interpret the political world. So the best explanation for why people vote the way they do is their party identification. And the point, this data, the reference to the ANES, that's just an acronym for the American National Election Study. It's a national face-to-face survey. It collects data during every presidential contest about why people vote the way they do. And what we see here is that the differences that I made reference to regarding vote choice play themselves out not just in terms of which candidate people vote for, but also in terms of which party they identify with. These numbers haven't changed all that much over time either, except that there's some slight tendency for African Americans who've been flirting with 85 to 90% Democratic support since Lyndon Johnson, to become even more Democratic. And there's a slight, although consistent and persistent, tendency for whites who have abandoned the Democratic Party in the aftermath of the '64 contest to become increasingly Republican over time. But for the most part, those numbers aren't changing. The bottom line, takeaway message from this slide, it's not just about Barack Obama. I'm not going to say a lot about this slide here. Professor Bobo talked a lot about this as well. There's a concept in the social sciences referred to as racial resentment. It's a measure that has its critics, which is not important for the moment, but it's a measure of white racial conservatism. There hasn't been a lot of change over time. This is just a rate on a 0 to 1 scale, higher values meaning more racially conservative. Whites are, on balance, a racially conservative population. This is just based on national data. That isn't really changing much over time. And it, again, represents the challenges or opportunities that political figures face. That's the world we face. Most whites are Republican, and most whites are racially and ideologically conservative. So politicians who want to be victorious need to play to that audience for the most part, which is what they do. And by the way, they do it in both parties. The manner by which political figures try to exploit this racial landscape that I've made reference to and that my predecessors here at the podium have discussed as well is by trying to influence the manner by which voters make political judgments, that they make it on the basis of this criteria as opposed to that criteria. They do this via campaign ads, which I'll show you some this afternoon, speeches, and various other means of political communication. This process is broadly referred to in the political science literature as racial priming. Dr. Eberhardt talked a little bit about priming here a bit earlier, but in the psychological sense, it carries a somewhat different connotation than it does in the political science sense. Here, it's just a reference to public appeals made by political figures to try to convince voters to make their decisions on the basis of this criteria versus that criteria in the domain of race. And as it turns out, politicians, there's actually another means by which this occurs, but the two I'll talk about for most of my, during most of my comments this afternoon refer to explicit appeals to race, wherein racial nouns are employed, and more implicit appeals to race, where candidates engage in more of a subterfuge, more of a implicit, or I should say a subtle code word type effort to try to imply race without actually using racial nouns. Why would they do that? Well, because this provides more cover. Because when they engage in these kinds of implicit strategies and they get called out for it, kind of like Paul Ryan most recently with the comments that he made, that some of you may be familiar with. The Congressman Paul Ryan from Wisconsin made comments on a radio program about the lack of a culture of working in inner city communities. And someone, a number of someones actually criticized him on that. And he said, wait, that's not about race. I don't know where you got, I don't have a racist bone in my body. I didn't have anything to say about race. I'm just talking about culture of laziness, of not working in these inner city communities. But you use those terms and you know what people start to think about. The aim of these code words is essentially to encourage people to think about race without appearing to be doing so. That's essentially what the strategy is here. And politicians employ these strategies all the time. I'm going to provide you with examples of this. You can make your own judgment as to whether or not this is unfolding or not. Here are some familiar examples of racial code words and phrases that we've heard. I made a reference a moment ago to inner city. That's not, of course, technically a racial term, but that term is used and people typically generate in their mind racialized images, which is to say African Americans or perhaps Latinos. Of course, the illegal alien reference is also not technically about race or ethnicity or nationality, but it implies something along those lines. References to welfare or food stamps or government programs. The implication here, of course, in the political culture is that these are programs that are designed for those people, but not for us, which is to say for ethnic and racial minorities, oftentimes African Americans, but not for whites or non-Hispanic whites. References to hardworking Americans. That's usually a kind of an antithesis of a reference to minorities. Of course, minorities aren't hardworking, so hardworking Americans must mean some other population. Use of such terms like dependency or handouts or variants on that carry comparable meaning. Dr. Eberhardt just made references here at the podium to crime, language like law and order, that the Nixon administration in particular made excellent use of in the late 60s and early 70s with an explicit, we now know because of release of information in the presidential files from the Nixon administration, that there was an explicit racial aim between, when using such terms, law and order. They wanted to accomplish the very thing that I'm talking about this afternoon, and they were actually pretty good at it. You may have heard this term as well, references to family values and variants on this phrase speak to the perception that African Americans are bad parents, they are not parenting their children, that African American men in particular are fathering children but not parenting them, that somehow the African American community is uniquely guilty of poor family values. So all these examples that I've just provided, and obviously there are many more, are ways by which politicians, political figures, political elites can convey racial meaning without using racial nouns. As we'll see momentarily anyway, sometimes they're just using straight up racial nouns as well. But this is at least one of the many ways that they try to convey the messages that they're trying to get out there in the public. A couple of examples of folks. Again, there's many examples in recent American history, meaning over the last few decades, where high-profile political figures have made reference to these kinds of code words, phrases that I've just put on the table, one of which, of course, is this notion about states' rights. Some of you probably know where I'm going here. Of course, the reference to states' rights was, well, that was the rallying call of the Confederacy. And you may, if you've taken a history class or two, have some sense about what they were fighting for. It was also kind of a slogan used during the period of massive resistance to the civil rights efforts in the late to mid 1950s and 1960s. States' rights, states' rights. We know what that means. This is a particular term or phrase that was adopted by Ronald Reagan when he was on the campaign trail in 1980. He made this particular comment at the fairgrounds in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is noteworthy because the three civil rights workers, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, were murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964, I believe. And so when Reagan, presidential candidate Ronald Reagan, goes to Mississippi and declares in front of the microphone that I believe in states' rights, many people thought it was a dog whistle, as it were, a way to say with a wink and a nudge, I'm with you, I'm one of you, vote for me. Here's another one. This is just an excerpt, but it's a reference to a phrase we're all familiar with, I suspect, the notion that we will end welfare as we know it. This is a goal. This is a problematic program. We want to shut it down. Vote for me because I'm going to end welfare as we know it. That's now a Democratic, just to show my bipartisanship here. That's Bill Clinton in 1992 making this comment, among many others, during his acceptance speech for the Democratic presidential nomination. Bill Clinton engaged in quite a bit of this racial priming that I'm talking about, even though he is a Democrat, because this was his effort to try to diminish the losses that Democrats routinely have among white voters. So I'll come back to this theme again momentarily, but this racial priming effort is employed by Republicans primarily to exacerbate the extent to which whites are abandoning the Democratic Party, and Democrats employ a comparable strategy to try to limit the extent to which whites will be abandoning the Democratic Party. That's why Bill Clinton engaged in it with respect to this comment and a range of comments that Clinton made throughout the '92 campaign. This is all in spite of the fact, of course, that Bill Clinton is the first black president. This is a more recent vintage. More people have been put on food stamps by Barack Obama than any president in American history. As it turns out, by the way, that's wrong. George W. Bush was the president, at least at the time this comment was made, who had presided over the expansion of the food stamps, what we know as the food stamps program. He presided over a bigger increase than any other previous president. But Newt Gingrich made this comment in that very lofty, euphoric period where it appeared as if he might actually get the nomination. And this was his effort to try to solidify his credentials as a true conservative, which you might think, well, why would he need to bolster those credentials? But as it turns out, some folks were not entirely sold on that point. So Gingrich made this comment. The reference to food stamps, of course, it's a poverty program. References to poverty, references to government programs, those are ways of getting at issues of race without appearing to be talking about race. When he was called on this in fashion comparable to Paul Ryan, he denied it. He denied that it was about race, that his comments were about race. All right, so I'm moving too slowly here. I'll try to speed this up a bit. I'm going to talk now about some specific election cycles, the 2008 and briefly about the 2012 election cycle. Make very brief reference to some studies that I've engaged in that try to demonstrate empirically that indeed there is this association between these overt and covert appeals and how people evaluate political figures and political issues. I've kind of made these points already. I'll leave it on screen here just to drive home the point. Again, Democrats engage in this kind of effort in order to diminish or to stop, reduce the extent to which they are losing white votes, because ultimately a winning coalition for Democrats is going to have to be multiracial. Because although they have the lion's share of support among blacks and the Hispanics, there are not enough of them, at least in the national electorate, to guarantee success. Republicans, on the other hand, engage in this in order to speak to the very weakness that the Democrats have, and that's where we are in contemporary 21st century American politics. All right, so I'm going to show you an ad here in a moment from John McCain that attempts to, it seems innocuous enough. It's a McCain ad, and it's going to be critical of Obama, of course, understandably. But look at the racial subtext, in particular the imagery.
He's the biggest celebrity in the world. But is he ready to lead? With gas prices soaring, Barack Obama says no to offshore drilling and says he'll raise taxes on electricity. Higher taxes, more foreign oil. That's the real Obama.
I'm John McCain, and I approve this message.
All right, so that's innocuous enough, right? What am I talking about? Why is that about race? Well, the McCain campaign wanted to make the case that Obama was lacking in substance. He's a celebrity, but there's not a lot of there. But they juxtapose images of an African-American political candidate with two blonde white women. Why those particular celebrities? He could have chosen any celebrities. Why did he choose those celebrities? Well, it speaks to this concern throughout American history about miscegenation, about African-American males being predators with respect to white women. One could make a case. Now, admittedly, it has the feature here that someone could say, well, that's not what he meant. You're just projecting. That's not at all what he was trying to get at. There's also a reference near the end, by the way, where there's a big reference to foreign oil, the big word foreign, right to the picture of Obama. Obviously, we know that one of the rumors about Obama is that he's not born in the United States and that he is, of course, a secret Muslim. So I would make the case that there was a subtext embedded in this appeal that was about race, even as it appeared to not be about race. But it doesn't just happen again among Republicans. These are comments that were made during the very divisive primary battle in 2008 between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, where Clinton was trying to make the case that she was the preferred candidate because, of course, she had more support among hardworking Americans. Working, hardworking Americans, white Americans, that's a synonym. They all mean the same thing, right? And so she was very blunt about why, at the end of the day, she should get the nomination as opposed to her opponent. Now, there was some criticism that was leveled at Clinton at the time, but obviously her career continues to do just fine. In the aftermath, of course, she became Secretary of State and may well get the Democratic nomination in 2016, if of course she runs. But it wasn't just McCain and it wasn't just Clinton. Of course, Obama also spoke to some of these similar concerns in his infamous Father's Day speech, with a nice backdrop here as well. And the aim, of course, was to try to send a message that was especially important, one might argue, for Obama as a relatively new face on the political scene and as an African American. The presumption might be that if he were to be elected, he would govern with an eye towards assisting African Americans to the detriment of whites. He wanted to send the message, of course, that that was not the case. And he did this in a number of ways, very much consistent, by the way, with the other first black American president, Bill Clinton, by engaging in a series of symbolic efforts to send the message that he is not beholden to black interests, that he is not your traditional Jesse Jackson type Democrat, and this was a very good example of that, I would argue as well. I'm going to show you now another ad from the 2008 cycle, this one by Barack Obama. It's actually one of those more positive ads. There's no reference here to McCain. It's actually kind of a biographical ad about Obama, again, introducing himself to a national audience. This is the ad, it's called The Country I Love, that he began his national campaign with after he had solidified his nomination of the Democratic nomination for the presidency. But I want you to pay particular attention, again, both to the use of the code words I've tried to draw your attention to, like hardworking, like welfare, and also to the images of the supporters who he's pictured with in this biographical ad.
I'm Barack Obama. America is a country of strong families and strong values. My life's been blessed by both. I was raised by a single mom and my grandparents. We didn't have much money, but they taught me values straight from the Kansas heartland where they grew up. Accountability and self-reliance, love of country, working hard without making excuses, treating your neighbor as you'd like to be treated. It's what guided me as I worked my way up, taking jobs and loans to make it through college. It's what led me to pass up Wall Street jobs and go to Chicago instead, helping neighborhoods devastated when steel plants closed. That's why I passed laws moving people from welfare to work, cut taxes for working families, extended health care for wounded troops who'd been neglected. I approved this message because I'll never forget those values. And if I have the honor of taking the oath of office as president, it will be with a deep and abiding faith in the country I love.
Ran in Michigan in 2008. Michigan was a battleground state that cycle. And I remember thinking, wow, there's some real kind of not that subtle efforts here at racial priming, which is what I study. Obama making it clear to folks that he's indicating, I've got these Kansas values. Oh, by the way, this is my mother and this is what she looks like. And these are my grandparents and that's what they look like. There's references to hardworking, moving people from welfare, et cetera. That's all fairly standard. If that was anyone other than a black Democratic presidential candidate, we'd all be like, well, of course, that's what he's doing. But he was one of ours. He was a Democrat. They don't do that sort of thing, do they? Well, yes, they do, I argue. And I've even got some evidence here to back it up. We wondered, myself and my graduate student collaborators on this project, Spencer Piston, Vanessa Cruz, and Legina Gauss, what would be the reaction to folks if they had seen that same ad, that same narration, but we removed the white imagery just to see if people had a different impression of Barack Obama as a consequence. So now I'm going to show you the modified version of that same ad.
I'm Barack Obama. America is a country of strong families and strong values. My life's been blessed by both. I was raised by a single mom and my grandparents. We didn't have much money, but they taught me values straight from the Kansas heartland where they grew up. Accountability and self-reliance, love of country, working hard without making excuses, treating your neighbor as you'd like to be treated. It's what guided me as I worked my way up, taking jobs and loans to make it through college. It's what led me to pass up Wall Street jobs and go to Chicago instead, helping neighborhoods devastated when steel plants closed. That's why I passed laws moving people from welfare to work, cut taxes for working families, extended health care for wounded troops who'd been neglected. I approved this message because I'll never forget those values. And if I have the honor of taking the oath of office as president, it will be with a deep and abiding faith in the country I love.
So what's the point? The point here is to see whether or not it made any difference. And in particular, we ran a study. I'll just give you some information here about what we were engaged in. The aim was to see whether or not perceptions of Obama as a Muslim, perceptions of Obama as born outside the U.S. were enhanced with what was in fact the actual ad, the ad that emphasized his white ancestry and his white supporters, as opposed to a perfectly, an innocuous ad you could envision he might have run, but that would not have made those same kind of visual images and that same kind of point. We kind of stacked the deck against ourselves because the narration is constant, obviously, throughout. Same references, same use of code words that I've been talking about, like welfare to work, like hardworking, like making no excuses, etc. But we think the imagery in and of itself would be enough to generate an effect. And sure enough, as it turns out, particularly among Republicans, that seemed to be what we were finding. That is to say that Republicans who saw the modified version of the ad that removes the white supporters and the white family members, were more likely by a significant margin to think that Obama was secretly a Muslim. They were also more likely to think, and this is of course concentrated among Republicans, to think that he was definitely born outside the U.S. That figure gets even bigger if you look at definitely combined with maybe born outside the U.S. So this is a fairly, I think, at least somewhat convincing effort to demonstrate that there are implications to the images that politicians use when they craft their political messages, but it's also, it's not a very good way of getting at what was inside the head of the candidate or his handlers. We do have some evidence, which I can go into more detail about in Q&A, that suggests that the racial imagery across a range of ads, based on the content analysis that we did of McCain and Obama from 2008, show comparable levels. It basically indicate that Obama diminished the number of non-white figures in his ad relative even to John McCain. So there's at least some suggestive evidence that the candidates were engaged in what we think they were engaged in. But even if they weren't consciously aware of what they were doing, there were implications to having done so. All right, so I'm running a little bit out of time. I'll try to move quickly here. I'll skip the theoretical setup here and just say that we've also found in some other research that we've done that even when there are no references made to familiar stereotypes about blacks being violent or lazy, it's still possible to influence people's political judgments if we can simply pit black against white. Simply suggest that more positive policy support for African Americans comes at the expense of white Americans. One does not have to emphasize particular stereotypes, simply make the point that working on behalf of blacks somehow undermines whites' status in society. And I'll skip over this too. The point here being simply that people have in fact made such comments where they refer to the Affordable Care Act as a kind of a civil rights bill or reparations. And here's an ad that Romney ran in 2012.
You paid into Medicare for years. Every paycheck. Now you need it. Obama has cut $716 billion from Medicare. Why? To pay for Obamacare. So now the money you paid for your guaranteed health care is going to a massive new government program that's not for you. The Romney-Ryan plan protects Medicare benefits for today's seniors and strengthens the plan for the next generation. I met Romney and I approve this message.
A massive government program that's not for you. Well, who is it for? So we explored something that got at the spirit of this as well. I'll just go quickly here. Based on a study, an experiment we did back in 2010, the aim here was simply to contrast, to provide our survey participants our experimental subjects with information suggesting that whites were losing ground relative to blacks. That's it. There's no information here about blacks being gang members, lazy, welfare cheats, any of that stuff. In fact, the information we provided, this was just the control condition, the comparison, the information we provided suggested that blacks were gainfully employed. I don't expect you to be able to read the text of this treatment, but you can certainly see the headline. There's a photo here, of course, of an African-American individual who is gainfully employed. An earlier version of this project wanted to say blacks are making gains, but we thought that was really pushing the envelope. Turns out, of course, this information is not true. African-Americans, as Dr. Bobo pointed out previously, along with Hispanics, were hit especially hard during the economic downturn, but this information was provided to suggest otherwise to our experimental subjects to see whether or not this kind of intervention would affect how they evaluated political figures and policies. There is no reference in this treatment to Barack Obama. There's zero reference to him or to the Affordable Care Act, but it had implications for how people brought their, as it turns out, their white racial identity to bear on support for both of those things. So I'm almost finished here. Let me just show you very quickly. In terms of support for the Affordable Care Act, this is just a rate on a 0 to 1 scale, 1 being support, 0 being opposed. Most Americans, these are whites only in our study based on a national sample, were whether or not their identity as a white person was very important to them or not so much, it didn't make any difference in the control condition to their support for the Affordable Care Act, which was slightly below the median. But when they viewed the ad that provided information suggesting that whites were losing ground to blacks, that seemed to have a big implication for how they interpreted this policy. It's worth noting, by the way, that we had other versions of this ad, or excuse me, of this story, which I haven't shown just for time consideration purposes, where we contrasted white economic progress to Latinos, which had no impact, and that contrasted, or simply made no contrast at all, but simply indicated that whites were losing ground economically, but no comparison to any outgroup. And that occasionally worked, but the results I'm showing here were strong, whether they're compared to the story about cell phones or those other stories I just showed you. This particular distinction is especially potent in American politics. And almost done here. This is just a question about whether or not respondents thought that Obama favored blacks over whites, as opposed to favoring whites over blacks or treating both groups equally. As you can see, most people in our study, again, it's a rate on a 0 to 1 scale, were inclined to think that, in fact, Obama does favor blacks over whites, but there was no discrepancy in terms of how people who valued their white identity, by the way, that was about 2/3 of our respondents, versus those who did not. It was roughly comparable in both, on both ends of that scale, but it changes dramatically when they're presented with information suggesting that their group is losing out. There's no reference here to stereotypes, but there is reference to who's ahead, who's winning, and who's losing. All right, so last slide. I'm only slightly over. I want to convey to all of you information that's a little hard to digest, but I think it's true, and hopefully I've at least made a case for that, which is that not simply the big bad Republicans engage in what I'm referring to this afternoon as racial priming, but the virtuous Democrats as well. And the reason that they engage in these policies is, again, because it works. That's why they do it. And so we were all, of course, before we spoke here this afternoon, and we're, of course, very happy to be here, urged to come up with solutions. I've done very little of that so far. But in the spirit of trying to offer some solutions, I wanted to highlight the fact that if we want to discourage politicians from engaging in this kind of behavior, then we might want to look in the mirror because they're doing it for us. That's why they're doing it. They're doing it for us, and they're doing it because it works. If we're serious, then we're going to have to call politicians out. That doesn't mean that these politicians don't do good things, that they are evil in every way. I'm not making that case. The case I'm making is that they are making a calculation about their short-term political gain at the expense of the problems this country has grappled with since before its inception, with respect to racial inequity and racial division. And they're doing it because we're rewarding them when they do it. That's why they're doing it. If we're serious in our efforts to be critical of these efforts, we'll call these politicians out when they engage in these efforts, not simply when they're members of the other party, but perhaps especially when they're members of our party. Thank you.